Let's go straight to our top story at this hour. A day ahead of its quarterly review of the monetary policy, the Reserve Bank has sounded a word of caution. In its macroeconomic review, the central bank says the widening current account deficit is a constraint on monetary policy easing. The central bank expects growth to revive from the fourth quarter of this fiscal and expects inflation to moderate. But the central bank also continues to maintain that inflation remains above its comfort zone. Lata Venkatesh joins us now with the highlights of the macroeconomic review. Lata, a word of caution clearly coming in from the Reserve Bank. So can we at best expect a 25 basis cut, repo rate cut tomorrow?
Well, before I get into all that, let me first come to the highlights of the report. About the only positive sentence I could get in the report by way of a rate cut was that core inflation pressures have definitely declined and they are unlikely to emerge very quickly. Beyond that, even on inflation, the Reserve Bank is sounding very iffy. It says that even at the current level, inflation is way above RBI's comfort zone. And going forward in FY 13-14, inflation will continue to find difficulty in falling. One, because suppressed inflation will come up, correcting diesel prices, correcting railway tariffs, correcting electricity tariffs, as well food inflation and the wage price spiral. All this will keep inflation a bit sticky. So, continue to remain around 7%. On growth, they are very clear that even their 5.8% forecast, which they made in October, is unlikely to be achieved. A lot of professional forecasters whom they quote also agree, and their average has come down from 5.7 to 5.5. The important part in this report is that current account deficit has become way more important for the RBI than fiscal deficit. They flag off the concern by saying that a wide current account deficit of 4% for 2 consecutive years makes it very difficult for the Reserve Bank to cut rates and increase consumption. Because the more you increase consumption, the more you put pressure on the current account deficit. On fiscal deficit, they note the progress made, but they hope that the steps are persisted with. And as before, they point out that expenditure cutting should also be buttressed with expenditure switching. Because unless the government spends in certain areas, private investment will not crowd in. What is the hint for tomorrow's policy? That's most important. Well, the Reserve Bank repeatedly, at least 3-4 times, uses the phrase, we need to continue with the calibrated stance. Now, that phrase indicates that we have to continue with whatever stance we did previously. And previously, they didn't cut. They've only been cutting the CRR. So is that what they are hinting at? And the repeated reference to the current account deficit indicates, saying that constraints monetary policy gives a sense that they are not going to give you even that repo cut. Actually, we went back to the people whom we polled for the CNBC TV 18 poll, and many of them stuck to that 25 basis cut which they told us earlier, but with much less resolve. They were much less certain that that cut will come. So we will know that in a few hours.
All right, Lata, appreciate you taking us through the macroeconomic review, and let's see what the Reserve Bank finally does do tomorrow. But Lata was alluding to that poll that we have conducted. The expectations of a rate cut from the central bank almost seemed unanimous. A CNBC TV 18 poll among bankers and economists show that 95% expect the central bank to cut the repo rate. But it is a divided house on the question of the Reserve Bank turning its policy stance from hawkish to dovish. Gopika takes you through the findings of our poll.
The market is clearly positioned for a rate cut from the RBI governor on Jan 29th. 95% expect a rate cut, of which 90% see a 25 basis points cut and 5% a 50 basis points cut. Expectations on a CRR cut are less intense. Only 30% expect a CRR cut. 70% said the governor may prefer using OMO or open market purchase of bonds to infuse liquidity. In fact, when we asked respondents how much headroom the governor has to cut rates in 2013, given the deficit, savings rate and inflation constraints, 45% said not much, 25 or 50 basis points at best. However, the balance 55% see scope for a 75 to 100 basis points cut in 2013. Hence, on the governor's policy stance, only 50% thought he would be more dovish given the state of economy. 50% thought his stance would continue to be dominated by inflation and deficit concerns. Given the faster than expected fall in inflation, 50% expect RBI to scale down its March 31st inflation forecast to below 7.5%. 50% expect RBI to not change its forecast as the rise in diesel price will add on some points to the WPI. On GDP, 60% of our respondents said the governor may scale up the full year forecast to below the prevailing estimate of 5.8%. But key is what the banks do. Will they cut lending rates if the RBI cuts repo? 70% said yes. But will they cut deposit rates if RBI cuts the repo? Only 60% said yes. Now, that could be significant. In Mumbai, Gopika Gopakumaran.
So will he or won't he? That is the big question. And we've got our panel of guests right here to discuss and debate that. Keki Mistry, Adi Godrej and Shubhada Rao. Appreciate you joining us here on India Business Hour. Shubhada, let me start by asking you to make sense or read between the lines of what the Reserve Bank governor has said in the macroeconomic report today. Now, he says monetary policy needs to continue to be calibrated as inflation continues to be above the comfort level of the Reserve Bank. He also goes on to say then that the widening current account deficit is a constraint on monetary policy easing. So how would you then read these statements?
Yes, Shireen, I think the precursor to the tone being set for today's document was quite evident in the earlier statements made by Governor a week ago, that inflation still remains elevated and it's difficult to disregard the inflation trajectory at this point in time, particularly consumer inflation. So in that sense, some of the expectation that one was building in looking at the wholesale price index and particularly the core inflation trajectory, that it would pave for more aggressive easing, got toned down by the earlier comments of the governor, and these were only backed more amply in today's document. Rightly, he has expressed concerns on as much as retail inflation, on the widening current account gap, and more importantly, I think the point that he has driven home is while there are positive steps being taken by the government on some of these measures to enhance capital flows and attempt boosting investor sentiment, the ground reality is that probably the consumer and investor sentiment has not adequately been buoyed. And as such, my sense is the governor would deliver only a 25 basis point cut in repo rates tomorrow. But probably that is nearly given if you look at the last statement in the outlook, which says that a calibrated approach with focus increasingly on growth risks. So 25 basis points is given.
All right, so Shubhada, you're still saying a 25 basis point repo rate cut is a given. But Mr. Godrej, coming to you in the context of what the governor has said, and in a sense, he's perhaps tempering expectations. You can't make a correlation necessarily between what the macroeconomic policy says and what the credit policy finally does. But if you were to look at what the governor is saying, are you also like Shubhada then settling for a 25 basis point cut and nothing more?
Well, I think it will be good if there's a 25 basis point cut and further cuts in the months to come. Because what is very important is now to create a growth environment. And I hope the budget does that. I hope the credit policy does that. Growth is the only way we'll be able to even get out of the inflationary cycle. Because growth will lead, to my mind, to the appreciation of the rupee, which is the best way to fight inflation in our country.
Let's see if he obliges. But Mr. Mistry, let me ask you to stick your neck out. Do you believe it will be a 25 basis point cut tomorrow, or will it be nothing at all?
I think he's going to do 50 basis points between now and March. Now the question is it 50 basis points that's going to be entirely front-loaded, or is it going to be in 2 steps of 25 each, or is it going to be 0 now and 50 in March? I would probably rule out the last. So that leaves us with 2 choices, 25 now, 25 in March, or 50 now and probably nothing in March.
Okay, so you're betting on 50 till March, but let me put to you an argument that we're hearing in the street, and he may throw up a surprise in the way that he won't actually move on the repo, but he will ease liquidity by further cutting the CRR rate. You might in fact see between a 25 to 50 basis point CRR cut. Do you believe that that's something that we are likely to see?
I'm not very sure. I don't see why he would cut the CRR by 50 basis points, because whilst there is shortage of liquidity in the system, he's already cut CRR 2 times over in the last 3 to 4 months. I don't really see a CRR cut happening at this time. I would be more inclined to believe there would be an interest rate cut. Only question is, will it be 50 and 0, or will it be 25 and 25?
Okay, so you're not seeing a CII cut tomorrow. But Mr. Godrej, back to you. You were talking about further cuts through the year. But most people are saying 25 basis points now. You just heard Mr. Mistry say another 25 in March and 50. That would be enough for some time now, given the fact that we are currently seeing inflation continuing to be above the Reserve Bank's comfort zone and that the government must deliver on its promise of fiscal consolidation. Can we really see the investment cycle and the capex cycle to pick up if we really see only a 25 or a 50 basis point rate cut? How much difference would that really make from a lending rate point of view?
No, my perception is a little different. I think inflationary expectations are low. I think commodity are coming down in price all over the world. If we can ensure that the rupee does not depreciate and in fact appreciates a little from the present level through growth, I think inflation will be contained. And I think that will be best for the country because growth will create better revenues, it will lead to lower fiscal deficits, it will lead to an appreciation of the rupee and thus containment of inflation. So I think we can create a virtuous cycle if we bring interest rates down. And my feeling is that we should have at least a 200 basis points reduction during the calendar year 2013.
200 basis points. Even the most optimistic view on the street is 100 basis points, Mr. Godrej. But, Mr. Mistry, the consensus view is that the governor will do a 25 basis cut tomorrow. What does that mean in terms of lending rates? Because that's the question that people are asking. Can 25 basis points really make any difference to the consumer?
I'm not too sure if a 25 basis points cut in rates will immediately translate into lower lending rates unless and until banks follow it up with deposit rate cuts also, which I presume in due course they will. But you need to bear in mind that February, March are always 2 months when liquidity in the system is usually very tight. One of the reasons being advanced tax payment, the other reason being the fact that companies want to buy whatever plant and machinery they want to before 31st March, put it to use so they start getting depreciation for tax purposes. So liquidity historically, if you see the last 15-20 years, you'll find that barring 2008-2009, which was a very exceptional year, in every other year liquidity tends to become very tight in February and March. So I would expect a more or less similar thing to happen in the current year, and that's why I believe that a 50 basis points cut now will ease the pressure a fair bit.
Okay, let me get the economist on the panel to have the last word. Shubhada, you're betting on a 25 basis point rate cut tomorrow, completely ruling out the possibility of any sort of front loading, all the way up to 50, which people like Mr. Mistry say perhaps we could see tomorrow, perhaps even by March. Do you believe there's going to be any front loading at all? Are you expecting a repo rate cut and a CRR cut tomorrow, or just a repo rate cut?
I would think that he would restrict his action more to rate cut than a CRR. Over the last few months, he has been highlighting the need to support liquidity more through open market operations. And we believe that this is the approach which he will maintain and continue. A blunt instrument like a CRR cut, given his pronouncement and concerns on elevated inflation levels, I think CRR cut is also getting ruled out for tomorrow's action. So liquidity support will come, but more so through open market operations. That's the sense we get after reading the document.
All right, we will know tomorrow. Shubhada Rao, Adi Godrej, KK Mistry, appreciate you joining us here on India Business Hour. Let's take a break from the credit policy expectations and talk about the other big story in what seems to be a breakthrough for the goods and services tax.